is a parable, again, that Irv will be preaching on. Jesus began to speak to the chief priests, scribes, and elders in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went away. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them the share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again, he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. When they realized that Jesus had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd, so they left him and went away.
I have to confess to you that today's scripture is not one of my favorites. This is not Psalm 23, which everyone loves. It's not a delightful love story like what we find in the book of Ruth. It's not one of the inspiring visions of God's ultimate good intentions for us as found in the prophets or even in the book of Revelation. It's not the good but challenging teaching that we find in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It's not the love chapter that Paul wrote in the letter to the Christians that so many people like to include in their weddings. As a parable, it's not even like the parable of the sower, which we've enjoyed so much, illustrating with our children, having them plant seeds and seeing them grow under these grow lights. So it is a parable that contains images of exploitation and violence and murder and revenge. In her commentary on Mark, Don Otoni Wilhelm describes this as a disturbing and provocative parable. I can't speak for Pastor Caleb, but if I were to only preach on my favorite scriptures, I don't think this one would make the list. I do know, however, that is exactly why it's valuable to follow a lectionary, that is a plan of assigned text for preaching on. Having a text like this assigned to us, preachers, and to all of us, gets us out of our comfort zone and stretches us to broaden and deepen our thinking. So we're not skipping over this parable, although it was tempting. I will invite you to explore with me this morning what this parable may have meant to the community of Mark's churches and how it might inform us as we seek to follow Jesus in the midst of our own context where we are surrounded by, if not directly facing, resistance, conflict, and violence. You know, if I'm sensing all of you correctly, how you're feeling these days, I think we're in a good place as a congregation. We're not dealing with a crisis of conflict at the moment. Our relationships seem to be healthy and strong. We're doing well together. We love each other. And we've weathered, as you know, some painful conflict a few years ago when we sensed that the Spirit of God was calling us to become multicultural, multilingual, and fully inclusive. And that was a very hard time in our life together. There was resistance, and some people left the congregation at that point. So, from that experience that we have shared together, about the cost of making clear commitments and giving a clear witness to the good news that we feel we must share together, we can understand the cost that Jesus paid for doing the same. So I know some of you have had or have ached to have hard, honest conversations with maybe some family members or some friends, letting them know who you really are or your convictions and your commitments. And what makes those conversations so hard is that we fear that the person we want to talk to is going to reject us personally for what we share, or oppose us, or attack our ideas, or pounce on us for what we've shared. And in some cases, we might even fear emotional and physical harm. And that was the case for Jesus. He had not come into Jerusalem keeping his ideas to himself or staying neutral to keep the peace. He had entered Jerusalem on a donkey, and that in itself was a statement. And some have called Jesus' dramatic entry into Jerusalem a performance of street theater. By entering Jerusalem with such drama, Jesus put on public display his proclamation of the upside-down values and principles of God's reign. And then he turned over the tables in the temple, challenging the marketing of prayer. And with these dramatic actions, Jesus placed himself, Ched Meyer said, in the center of a messianic war of myths, a culture war, if you will, for the hearts and the minds of God's people. Now, crowds of people, when we read that part of the story, loved it and celebrated what Jesus was doing. But the chief priests and the scribes began to look for a way to kill him. Throughout Mark's gospel, we see that Jesus was opposed by legions, by demons, and by religious leaders. And for this, he would be led to the cross. And yet, for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, Jesus' staged entry into Jerusalem on a donkey and his suffering servant kind of messiahship was a sure sign of God's reign. Well, thinking about these hard things and these interesting things, I found Dawn Otoni Wilhelm's introduction to this section of Mark to be insightful. She writes, "The cross, or we might say the cost of the work that Jesus was doing, is everywhere present in the Gospel of Mark, casting its shadow and illuminating the way ahead for Jesus and his followers." The first time I read that, I read it quickly, and it didn't almost catch the strangeness of what she was saying. How does the cross both cast a shadow and at the same time illuminate the way forward? In other words, how can the absence of light produce light? Or how can a shadow illuminate our way? And yet, I think she's onto something very intriguing. That is exactly what Mark's gospel wants us to understand. The way of the cross is the way forward. The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ reveal God's way of overcoming evil. She went on to say, it reveals God's way of participating in our human suffering, and above all, of transforming sin and death into newness of life by the power of God's love. In Mark's portrayal of the passion of Jesus Christ, God's love is greater than the power of human sin. It's greater than systemic evil. It's greater than satanic forces. It's greater than even death itself. I think we want to follow, try to understand and follow in this very different but powerful way of overcoming evil and unleashing good news. We want to follow Jesus. But in this moment, in today's scripture, Jesus is confronted with the cost of taking a clear stand And that cost is fierce opposition. It's like he's trying to plant seeds in hard soil, the hard soil of the pathway that we've been talking about in the parable of the sower, the place where the seeds of the good news can't take root because the soil is too hard, and the birds come and snatch them away before they can grow. And we may think of moments like this when we've been trying to plant in hard soil, feeling like the good seed that we want to sow is just brushed away by others, leaving us wondering if we can have any influence for good. We find Jesus in this scripture today in that kind of hard soil situation. He's in the middle of a really hard conversation with people who would love to see him dead. Not the kind of conversation we would relish. They had been questioning him and challenging him in every which way. And so he engaged these hard-hearted people with a disturbing parable based on some of the words of the prophet Isaiah. Now, in Isaiah's words, Israel is compared to a vineyard which God planted in the hope of a good harvest of grapes. And it sounds a little like the parable of the sower, in which the seeds of good news are planted in good soil in hope of having a good harvest. Actually, in the sower parable, it's not all good soil, but there is that hope that it will produce a harvest. And Isaiah pens these words, interestingly, as a love song. It goes like this: I will sing for my beloved, my love song concerning this vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard, and on a very fertile hill, and he dug it, and he cleared it of stones, and planted it with choice vines, and he built a watchtower in the midst of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it, and he expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded rotten grapes. The Lord had expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry. The sudden words of judgment seem fitting this week. If you've been watching the news, many of you heard, I'm sure, about the Israeli soldiers who fired into a crowd of desperately hungry people seeking food for their children, and many people got trampled to death in the chaos. And among all the conflicting viewpoints and accusations about what exactly happened, one thing is clear: this represents rotten fruit, bloodshed, and cries. And Isaiah presents this judgment as the love song of a heartbroken God who expected good fruit from his beloved vineyard people, not violence and cruelty. So Jesus takes these words of love and judgment and refashions them for those who are standing before him who wanted to kill him. A man planted a vineyard, he began, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Sounds familiar, right? The words of Isaiah. But then Jesus takes these familiar words of Isaiah in a very different direction. Rather than focusing on the harvest, on rotten grapes, Jesus focuses on the behavior of the tenant farmers. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just know that tenant farming in ancient Palestine under Roman occupation was an unjust system of economic exploitation. Everyone listening to Jesus would have known how those large land estates were run. Romans called these latifundium, and they were managed in ways similar to sharecropping in post-slavery America. It was a rigged system which essentially guaranteed that the worker tenants were perpetually indebted and legally trapped. And so we could look at this parable and begin to have some sympathy for the tenants, from the perspective of the tenants who had a legitimate grievance and valid reasons for resistance. Perhaps Jesus intended this to be part of the complexity of the story, but for today we'll just note that and move on. After preparing the vineyard, Jesus said the landowner leased the vineyard to tenants and went away, and in due time, when the time of the harvest came, the owner sent a slave to the tenants to collect his share of the produce. But the tenant seized the slave, beat him, sent him away empty-handed. So the owner sent a second slave for the collection, and this one they beat over the head and insulted. In other words, he was treated worse than the first. And then the owner sends a third slave, and this one they killed. The violence is escalating. The owner doesn't give up, but sends many more slaves, some of which were beaten, some killed. He sent everyone he had. I had missed that detail in this story. I hadn't remembered that. Sent everyone he had until the only one left was his beloved son. Now, the words beloved son should ring a bell if you've been paying attention to the stories of the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus was baptized, you remember, just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove upon him, and a voice came from the heavens, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." And I think we're expected to make that connection here. The parable seems to be about Jesus sent by God to God's vineyard, the vineyard being a symbol of Israel, God's people, and the owner sends his beloved son to the tenants saying, "They will respect my son." They didn't. They said, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him. The inheritance will be ours." So they seized him, killed him, threw him out of the vineyard. They didn't even give him the decency of a proper burial. This is a violent story, and it's disturbing on so many levels, as Dawn Otoni Wilhelm stated in her commentary. We could and should raise all kinds of questions about the behavior of everyone in this story. The tenants are cruel and murderous, even if they do have legitimate grievances. The landowner seems to care little for the well-being of his slaves and seems reckless with the life of his son. The slaves suffer beatings and death, and they were just caught in the middle of this conflict between the heir and the tenants. What follows in the story, though, is a question, and how we interpret the answer to the question determines much about how we understand this parable. Jesus asks, "What then will the owner of the vineyard do?" And immediately an answer is given. He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Now, the $64 question is this: who answered the question? Who said that the owner would come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others? Did Jesus give the answer? Or did the crowd answer the question? Mark doesn't say. It's left ambiguous for us. Jesus asked the question, and either he or someone else answered it. Now, if we go over and compare in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew has his own take on this parable, and maybe Matthew is trying to correct a misreading of Mark or just wanted to clear up the ambiguity. According to Matthew, Jesus did not answer the question. The people in the crowd answered the question. According to Matthew, likely the very people who were opposing Jesus, who wanted to kill him, were perhaps the ones who answered the question. They are the ones who said, "He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others." If Matthew's reading is correct, those religious leaders trapped themselves in their own answer to Jesus' question. It was their worldview, not the worldview of Jesus. It was their worldview that God acted like the violent, unjust owner of a latifundium. And then it dawned on them. Jesus was showing them that they were acting like the violent tenants in the story. They were the ones rejecting and even beating the prophets of God that God had been sending to them. They were the ones who now, the beloved Son of God before them, they were rejecting and planning to have killed. They were the tenants. And according to their own worldview, not the worldview of Jesus, they deserved to be destroyed. Jesus had exposed them, or rather they exposed themselves. They were the ones not honoring God with a harvest of good fruit. They were the ones rejecting God's initiatives. They were the ones rejecting God's beloved Son. They were the source of the violence in the story. They were the ones like the birds in the parable of the sower who were snatching away the seeds and the good news harvest. They were not the owners of the vineyard. God is the owner. So we read in verse 12, when they realized that Jesus told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd, and so they left and went away. This is such a tough scripture. This was a hard conversation that Jesus had with people who opposed him so fiercely that they wanted to arrest him and have him killed. He used a love song from the prophet Isaiah as the basis for the conversation that he had, the song of divine love, heartbroken, because the people that God loved were not bearing good fruit. This parable seems like a tragedy, right? There's no good news on the hard path. We are moving closer to the cross. The shadow of the cross hangs over this story in this final week of Jesus' life among us. So is it possible that the shadow of the cross illumines our way, as Dawn Otoni Wilhelm said in her commentary? I do see a glimmer of hope, of promise in verses 10 and 11 of the scripture. As Jesus was including this really intense and extremely difficult conversation with the religious leaders, he asks, have you not read the scripture? And if you're interested in looking this up, he's quoting now from Psalm 118. Have you not read the scripture, he said, that says that the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing to our eyes. There's a brethren songwriter, Sean Kirshner, who's written and performed just an absolutely beautiful piece of music with these very words. Powerful song. The stone that the